What if I told you that one of the world's richest and cleanest nations was once a crime-ridden slum with no resources, no army, and no hope? In 1965, Singapore was drowning in poverty, addiction, and ethnic violence. It had just been kicked out of its merger with Malaysia, left isolated and defenseless. Its people were divided, its economy broken, and its future uncertain. And yet, within just a few decades, this tiny island transformed into a global powerhouse. A place with one of the lowest crime rates, best infrastructure, and highest standards of living anywhere on Earth. So, how did this miracle happen? What kind of leadership, policies, and people made this possible? In this video, we dive deep into the extraordinary story of Singapore's rise, a story that will challenge everything you think you know about nation building. This video is sponsored by the Fire Digital, your all-in-one marketing solution. From branding and logo design to powerful websites, getting your site found on Google with SEO, and even video editing, they provide everything you need to grow your business online. Visit www.thefiredigital.com. The link's in the description. Collapse and chaos, the fall of Singapore, pre-1965. In the years leading up to its independence, Singapore was engulfed in poverty, instability, and social decay. Under British colonial rule, it was treated merely as a trade outpost, a port city with no significant investment in its people or infrastructure. The local population was crammed into overcrowded slums with no access to clean water, adequate sanitation, or health care. Crime, disease, and unemployment plagued everyday life, while opium addiction was rampant, with thousands relying on the drug just to survive the harshness of reality. Education was a luxury, and illiteracy was widespread, further entrenching the cycle of poverty. World War II pushed the country into an even darker period. In 1942, the Japanese invaded Singapore and occupied it for more than 3 years. During this time, brutal atrocities were committed, from mass executions and torture of civilians to the horrific abuse of women in so-called comfort stations. Infrastructure was destroyed, thousands were killed or displaced, and the psychological wounds left behind were deep. When the Japanese finally surrendered in 1945, Singapore was in shambles. The city was scarred, broken, and barely functioning. The British resumed control but made only modest improvements. There was still a lack of adequate housing, poor public services, and no clear economic direction. Political unrest began to rise, fueled by deepening ethnic tensions between the Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities. Violent riots broke out occasionally, reflecting the fragile nature of Singapore's social fabric. Drug addiction and prostitution worsened, and crime surged as job opportunities remained scarce. For many, Singapore seemed like a failed state in the making, a slum city with no future. The turning point, independence, and the rise of Lee Kuan Yew, 1965 onward. In 1965, Singapore faced an existential crisis. After a short-lived and uneasy merger with Malaysia, it was abruptly expelled due to political and racial tensions. Singapore's ruling People's Action Party, PAP, had contested national elections in Malaysia, which was seen as a threat by the Malaysian government. Combined with Singapore's large Chinese population and economic grievances on both sides, the separation became inevitable. Lee Kuan Yew, the newly elected prime minister, was devastated. On national television, he wept while announcing the separation, a moment that captured the fear and uncertainty of a country suddenly thrust into independence. At that moment, Singapore had no military, minimal international recognition, and was still heavily reliant on British troops who were scheduled to leave. The country was vulnerable, economically, socially, and politically. Lee Kuan Yew, however, saw beyond the crisis. He knew that time was limited and began working immediately to build institutions that could stabilize the nation. One of his first moves was to convince the British to delay their troop withdrawal by 4 years. This gave Singapore precious time to train its own military, strengthen its economy, and begin laying the foundation for a new society. Lee Kuan Yew's early years in power were marked by bold, often unpopular decisions aimed at survival and growth. He spearheaded the creation of ASEAN to establish regional cooperation and built diplomatic bridges that opened Singapore to international partnerships. At home, he focused on creating a multicultural, meritocratic society where citizenship would be defined not by race or religion, but by contribution and character. This vision of unity, backed by relentless policy execution, marked the beginning of Singapore's transformation from a fragile island to a stable, independent republic. Rebuilding society, education, cleanliness, and ethnic harmony. Understanding that true transformation begins with people, Lee Kuan Yew prioritized education as the foundation of national development. The government made primary education mandatory and invested in building top-tier public schools and technical institutions. Unlike many developing nations that focus solely on rote learning, Singapore's curriculum emphasized practical skills, the kind needed to drive industries and innovation. By making education affordable and widespread, Singapore quickly developed a skilled workforce that could compete globally, despite the country's lack of natural resources. But Lee knew that social harmony was just as important as academic excellence. Ethnic riots during the 1960s revealed how fragile Singapore's multicultural identity truly was. To prevent future unrest, the government implemented the Ethnic Integration Policy, which required public housing developments to reflect the country's ethnic composition. This meant that Chinese, Malays, and Indians would live as neighbors, not in segregated ghettos. The goal was simple but revolutionary: force daily interaction so people would see each other not as rivals, but as fellow Singaporeans. Initiatives like Racial Harmony Day taught children to respect all religions and ethnicities from a young age, making integration a lived experience. Lee also recognized the symbolic power of cleanliness. He launched the Keep Singapore Clean campaign in 1968, turning hygiene into a national mission. Public spitting, littering, and even chewing gum were banned. Laws were enforced with stiff penalties, and entire neighborhoods were rebuilt, slums replaced with modern public housing. Clean toilets, recycling stations, and waste management systems were introduced with military precision. This wasn't just about appearances, it was about instilling discipline, order, and a shared sense of pride in public spaces. Singapore was being rebuilt, not just physically, but culturally. Economic reinvention, from port city to global powerhouse. Lacking natural resources, Singapore had no choice but to innovate economically. Lee Kuan Yew turned the nation's strategic location into its greatest asset. By modernizing the port and building one of the world's best airports, Singapore became a critical node in global trade. The government created the Economic Development Board to attract foreign investment and cut bureaucratic red tape to make it easy to do business. Corporate taxes were kept low, and the process of starting a business was made fast and transparent, laying the foundation for the country's rise as a global financial and trading hub. To ensure sustainable growth, Singapore avoided debt and adopted a culture of fiscal discipline. One of its most powerful tools was Temasek Holdings, a government-owned investment company that managed profits from state enterprises and global investments. Instead of selling off public assets to private entities, Singapore managed them efficiently, generating long-term returns for the state. Meanwhile, citizens were enrolled in the Central Provident Fund, CPF, a mandatory savings scheme that covered housing, retirement, and healthcare. This created one of the highest savings rates in the world, making Singapore both economically self-reliant and socially secure. Singapore also climbed the industrial value chain with incredible speed. Initially relying on low-end manufacturing like textiles and rubber, the government shifted focus toward high-tech sectors such as semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and aerospace. Companies were required to contribute to a skills development fund, which helped train employees in advanced technical fields. By the 1990s, Singapore had become an integral part of global supply chains, not by exploiting resources, but by developing a world-class workforce. Its economic model became one of the most admired in the world, proving that resourcefulness could trump resources. The legacy of Lee Kuan Yew: governance without glory-seeking. One of the most extraordinary aspects of Singapore's transformation is how little of it was tied to personal ego. Lee Kuan Yew, despite overseeing one of the most successful national developments in modern history, actively discouraged the building of statues or monuments in his name. He believed that institutions, not individuals, should define a nation. To this day, there are no major public spaces named after him, no cult of personality, and no political dynasty controlling the country, just enduring systems built on meritocracy, transparency, and efficiency. Lee's strategy to eliminate corruption was simple but highly effective. He paid ministers and public officials salaries competitive with the private sector to remove the incentive for bribery. He introduced performance-linked bonuses and created the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, CPIB, an autonomous body that even the Prime Minister couldn't control. Severe punishments were put in place, including fines and jail time, ensuring that corruption was not just discouraged, but dismantled at its root. This helped build an environment of trust and efficiency, drawing in foreign investment and public confidence alike. Today, Singapore is a living legacy of Lee Kuan Yew's vision, a place where order, discipline, and fairness take precedence over populism or personal glory. While his governance wasn't without criticism, especially around press freedom and political dissent, even his critics acknowledge his unmatched contribution. Singapore is now among the cleanest, safest, and richest countries in the world. It is a rare example of a leader who focused not on being celebrated, but on creating a country worth celebrating. That, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson he left behind. Singapore's story isn't just about growth. It's about disciplined planning and refusing to accept limitations. With no natural resources, no inherited wealth, and no strategic allies, this country didn't just survive, it thrived. Lee Kuan Yew's legacy wasn't built on grand speeches or statues. It was built on clean streets, working systems, and the belief that government should serve the people, not itself. While no nation is perfect, Singapore proved that with the right vision and courage, even the smallest country can achieve greatness. If this story inspired you, let us know in the comments below. Would you want to see policies like this in your country? What stood out to you the most? And if you'd like to hear more stories like this about cities, leaders, and nations that defied the odds, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Because the next transformation might just be one you never saw coming.